Welcome csc200 class, and I'm just going to review a few of the slides from the PowerPoint from our textbook from Cengage, the Intro to Database Management. And there's about 43 slides in this, and I just want to go over just a couple important ones just to get us started here in the semester. I gave you some YouTube videos to review already from some other sources, but I just wanted to point out some information that's available in here that's in the textbook that's kind of important to what we're talking about. In our book, they talk about something called the BITS company. It's an IT solutions company, and they describe some of the problems they're having using Excel. You could recognize that this is Excel here with the green at the top. And they talk about redundancy, and they have some security problems and things like that by using Excel. So they're moving to Access, which is a database program. Now, we're not going to be using Access, but there's nothing wrong with bringing up Access because it'll be similar to what we're doing. Now, down here at the bottom, you could see some of their problems are redundancy problems. They're repeating things on different lines on their spreadsheet. So that usually increases errors, meaning if somebody changed the name and you had it in different places, it wouldn't be updated. That's an issue that's always a problem in databases, redundancy. Also, it says there's difficulty accessing related data. That means they have to go through various spreadsheets to find the things they need to find. So that can sometimes be a problem, and it also takes longer. And also the security features. There's less security features in Excel than there would be in Access or in a web-based database system or a more secure relational database management system. They bring up some terminology, and this is, simple terminology, a database, a structure that contains data. That makes sense. It also mentions there's relationships between categories of information. That indicates it's a relational database with different categories. We know that already, and you've already seen some videos that discuss relational databases, and that's the kind we're going to be working on. It also uses the term entity. Now, some of the other videos don't mention entity, but you'll see that in your book, and that's a very common term with databases, and that's the more formal term. And the entity is really what the table consists of. It could be a person, it could be a place, it could be an object. For the BITS company, they have entities for consultants, clients, orders, tasks. If you were a school or college, you can have entities for students. You can have entities for faculty. You could have entities for courses, for classrooms, and things like that. And they would be related to each other. If you had a table of classrooms, it would indicate what courses were in that classroom. And same thing, if there was a course, it might indicate what one classroom that course was in. That's what an entity is, and there'll be multiple entities usually in a database, and those are usually represented by the tables. Another term that you'll see pop up is attribute. Now, in the other videos, they just mentioned columns and fields, but attributes is the formal term that'll represent those columns or fields. So that's more of an overreaching term that you'll see. Basically, the categories is really what the attributes are. Because if you had a person, their categories would be, well, their name, their address, things like that. If it would be a student, it would be their student ID and all the details related to them, their address, all their personal details, their GPA, stuff like that. If it was a classroom, for example, the attributes of a classroom might be the capacity in the classroom. It might be the technology in the classroom. The amount of seats that it has, the amount of computers that it has, whether it has computers or not, whether it has a projector or not, whether there's software in there, whether it's a Windows lab or a Mac lab, whether they have installed software or if it just has Office. Things like that would be the attributes of a classroom. And the relationship between courses. Another term is the relationship. The book mentions the client-consultant relationship. They have a consultant will have many clients, and a client will only have one consultant. So that's kind of the relationship that they show in the BITS IT company. But in a school situation, even if I'm just talking about classrooms and courses, there could be a table of many classrooms and a table of many courses. And for each course, it's only going to have one classroom. At least for that particular section of a course, it's only going to have one classroom. But a classroom might list many courses. It might have 4 or 5 courses over the course of a day. So that's its particular relationship that it has. They're related. So you don't want to duplicate information, even though the same information may be in 2 tables, you don't want to duplicate it. And I'll show how to do that in some of these slides here. This is a graphic that shows the BITS company, their consultant entity, and the client entity. And you can see they have different attributes. The consultants have a consultant number, last name, first name, street, all that kind of stuff. And same thing with the clients, but they have a client number and their information. But one thing that the clients have is they have a consultant number. because each client will have one consultant. So they have a particular consultant that they work with. Now you might say, well, in the consultants entity, why don't they have a block that says clients? Well, because they'd have to list a whole bunch of clients, and that wouldn't really make sense. So the clients are already listed in the client table. So what they would do, if you needed to find, well, let's say what clients does one particular consultant have? Well, you'd run a query through the client table, and you would find all the clients that have consultant Smith or whatever, or consultant number 3. And on the right side there, it has each client is matched up to a consultant number. So that's where they'd find those particular numbers. And that way it wouldn't duplicate information. So if someone's consultant number changed, or if someone's name changed, their address changed, that's all in the consultant entity table. And then the only thing linking that to the client is basically the consulting number. So it's just pointing back to that area. So that's the idea of not duplicating information. It's sharing information. It's pointing back to where the original information is, but it's not duplicating it in each table like the way a spreadsheet would in Excel. So that's what's kind of happening here. And again, here's the relationship. There's a consultant, and you can see the consultant is plugged into the client. So a client will have one consultant, but a consultant can have many clients. So they're not going to put the many clients in the consultant table. They'll just point to them. You can just run a query and find out all the clients that are part of that consultant, and you could pull them from the clients table. You don't have to put all the client names in the consultant table because they already exist in the client table. And that's the idea of the many relationships and the sharing of information that can take place with database management systems as opposed to just spreadsheets. Now, one thing they'll bring up too, and you'll hear this, is an ERD or an ER diagram, and that just means the entity relationship. That's basically just a sketch or a grid of what's happening. And that kind of helps people visualize what's happening in the table, because if you're just looking at data, it's hard to see it, especially if you're using command line and stuff like that. That can get very confusing, but this gives you a visual picture of how everything's related and where the information is. It doesn't indicate all the records that are in it, but it does indicate the relationships, and that's why it's called an entity relationship diagram, so you can see the entity and the relationships. Here's an example of an entity relationship diagram. And in all the boxes that they have there, they're showing all the, and you might have seen this in Access if you ever worked in Access before. In the small boxes, the bottom parts, it's showing all the columns or the fields or the attributes formally. And at the top, where you see consultant, client, work orders, this graphic is somewhat blurry, but those are all the tables or the entities. So it's kind of showing them, and they use lines to kind of describe what's related to each other and where there's a one-to-many and a many-back-to-one relationship, and sometimes even a many-to-many relationship. That's all kind of broken down in these diagrams. Before you'd even build a database, you'd probably sketch out a diagram like this and then kind of build it up from here. And that's called an ERD, Entity Relationship Diagram. One of the last things I want to point out, this is a nice graphic here showing the user, the database, and then the database management system in the middle here. Now, when we start out, we're going to use the MySQL database management system. So that's going to be in the middle, and we're just going to pull information from our database. And remember, our database is just text. It's just code. It's just a file that puts a bunch of information in columns and rows. That's all it really is. The management system is the software that's going to allow us to run queries and pull information from that database and display it. Now, to do that, we're going to use command line. We're going to use a command line interface, a CLI, and that's all we're going to do in the beginning, and we're going to be doing that in Python Anywhere. Now, after that, you can see there's another block here. There's a program. Eventually, after we do that, we're going to want to display things a little nicer in like a web page. And under the program part, first we're going to use Python for a little bit because we're going to be able to use Python in Python Anywhere. But then we're going to use PHP. So that's where we're going to switch to VS Code, and we're going to be using PHP, and we're going to have to set up our virtual server with AMPs. So we're going to be doing that. We're still going to use the MySQL database management system. We'll be using that, but we'll just be adding another layer of communication, which is going to be the PHP. That will allow us to grab that information and put it together in a web page. And with a web page, we'll also be able to create a form that'll kind of go back and forth so that people will be able to put information in a form and add to the web page and add things to the database, and then also grab information from the database and display it on a web page. So we'll be able to do that with this extra block of information, which is the program. That's where we'll be using PHP, that's where we'll be using Python, and we'll be giving more information back to the user. Now also there's something called phpMyAdmin. Now that's just a little helper program that's going to help us work in a database. That's so we don't have to work in command line all the time. phpMyAdmin is more of a graphical program that we can work with a database, but that doesn't really help us. That doesn't send information back to the user. That just gives us information as we look at it. So that's just another little helper, but that's not really part of this process. It might help a little bit, but it's not really going to help our communication in this process. Now finally, I just want to mention here the advantages of database processing, because these bullet points here are probably one of the more important things in the chapter. And I'm not going to go through all of them because we won't face all of these things yet. But one of the things that it mentions here and that they're talking about in the case study that they have in the book, they're talking about getting more information from the same amount of data. So they have all that data there. You just want to use the stuff that you have. You don't want to duplicate it. That's what that means. Getting more information from the same amount of data. That means don't duplicate it. That means sharing data. You know, you already have a list of clients, so you don't want to duplicate that. Balancing conflicting requirements. I don't know if we're going to get into that yet. Redundancy. And now that's what we're talking about. We don't want to duplicate information. Redundancy is duplicating information that's not necessary to duplicate. If you're duplicating things, there's more chance of screwing it up, of updating it in one place but not updating it in another place. It gives you two places where you then have to update things. If you can do it from one central place, that's a lot easier, and that's what databases do. You could control information from one central place and just keep reusing it, kind of like style sheets and things like that. And it's also going to keep things consistent. You're not going to have things displayed in a different way or anything in different tables. It'll keep its integrity because everything will reference each other. Security, databases naturally have much better security than would a spreadsheet program. Help productivity. People won't have to be looking through multiple spreadsheets and files and things like that. Everything will be in one central place. And also there's data independence because it breaks down the data in smaller parts. So that's what kind of happens with a database, and you'll learn more about that as you work with a database. You're not going to look at this bullet list and understand everything they're talking about. But as you start working with databases more, you'll start to picture it, and as you start looking at case studies, you'll kind of get the idea of it. Obviously, the best place to learn about it would be working with a system, whether it's an educational system or a company where you're dealing with databases on an everyday basis. You'll be able to understand that a little bit better. Also, it says the disadvantages of database processing. It's not perfect. You know, it's more complex. There's more to learn. There's a greater impact of failure. If your database goes down, that's a big problem. It's harder to recover things. You know, it's larger file size. You have to hire someone who really knows how to work the database and knows how to work with the servers and things like that. It's not just a piece of software that you're running under Microsoft Office. So it can be a lot more complex. So that's one of the disadvantages of database processing. But considering if companies are getting bigger and bigger, that's why they're going to look towards relational database management systems.